Parshas Tazria. Parshas Tazria starts off with talking about the mitzvah of bris milah, about birth, but then it goes on, and the most of the Sedra deals with the laws of Tzaraas, of leprosy. There is some question as to whether Tzaraas is really leprosy or Tzaraas is some phenomena that is not scientific at all, a supernatural phenomena. Anyway, the Torah tells us about three forms of leprosy. Torah tells us about leprosy, or Tzaraas, I should say, that affects the human being, where there's discolorations and all kinds of physical signs. And then the Torah tells us about Tzaraas that affects the clothes of a person. And then the Torah tells us also about Tzaraas that affects the house of the person. But what is interesting is that the Torah, in telling us about the Tzaraas, now Tzaraas is seen by our sages as a punishment for various sins. The sin that is most associated with Tzaraas is lashon hara, talking bad about somebody else. But all kinds of other sins are also associated with Tzaraas. You have medrashim that list 12, you have medrashim that list 10, you have medrashim that list 8 and 9 sins that are associated with Tzaraas. Now, the Rambam, at the end of Hilchos Tumas Tzaraas, so he says that if a person spoke lashon hara, this phenomena doesn't exist in our contemporary times. But if a person would talk lashon hara, and as a result of the lashon hara, the Tzaraas would affect his house. There would be signs of discoloration or leprosy or whatever you want to call it on the walls of the house. Something altogether supernatural, at least seemingly supernatural. And then, if a person persists in speaking lashon hara, in spite of the fact that his house became contaminated and his house was destroyed, then the Tzaraas affects his clothes. And if a person persists, even after dealing with the clothes that became tamei, and he persists in talking lashon hara or committing the other sins, so then the Tzaraas affects him. And there seems to be a dispute between many of the commentaries as to the nature of Tzaraas. There are those, the Rabbi is of the opinion that the Tzaraas was a natural disease And he strains himself to explain how this natural disease could affect one's clothes. And then, but most of the commentaries see the Tzaraas as being something supernatural, not normal, not part of science, or science as we know it. From the Rambam's words in the Yad HaChazaka and Hilchos Tumas Tzaraas, it seems to me that the Rambam differentiated between the Tzaraas that affects a person, which might have been, even though I've seen many who disagree about that, which might have been somewhat of a natural phenomena, and the Tzaraas that affects the house and the clothes, which was supernatural, that cannot be understood in any form or shape from a scientific perspective. Now, what's interesting is that the Rambam, in discussing discussing this question, the Rambam says that initially the sinner, the one who spoke Lashon Hara, the original sinner, his house became affected. Then, if he persists, then his clothes become affected. And then if he persists, then he becomes affected. And this raises two questions. The first question is, when we take a look in this week's Sedra, and to a certain degree next week's Sedra, the Torah introduces us to Tzaraas first by talking about Tzaraas affecting the person himself. The Torah then talks about Tzaraas that affects the clothes. And then the Torah tells us about Tzaraas that affects the house in the opposite order that the Rambam mentions it. Rambam says first it affects the house, then it affects the clothes, and then it affects the person. And so we have to understand, why is it that the Torah mentions it in the opposite order, that the Tzaraas actually would take place? And then the second question is that you would think that initially, at least according to that, initially the more normal thing happens. Now it's true, there is a dispute whether Tzaraas is a natural phenomenon, as I mentioned, or it's a supernatural phenomenon. But even if you say that it's a supernatural phenomena, when the Tzaraas affected the human being, when it affected the person, it had similarities to diseases, skin diseases. It might not have been those same skin diseases, but there were similarities to it. But when it affected the clothes, when it affected the house, that would seem on the basis of logic, even though the Rabbi seems to say to the contrary. But even the Barbanel, who was a rationalist in the way he explains the Torah, somewhat jumps on the Ralbag, and he dismisses the idea that Tzaraas on the clothes, for sure, that it could be considered a natural phenomenon. So you would have expected the more natural thing to happen first, and the more supernatural thing to happen later. But according to the Rambam, first it affects the human being. First it affects the house, which is supernatural, or seemingly supernatural. Then it affects the clothes. And then later, it affects the human being. And when it affects the human being, it bears similarity to disease. It bears similarity to things that are normal. So how are we to understand the order, the logic, or the message of the order that the Rambam is telling us? Now, I think in regard to the second question, it's very easy to understand. Man was created pure. The soul that you put into me is tar. Not only that, we could actually mention, as Reb Chaim Volozhiner in the Nefesh HaChaim says, the neshama shenasata bi, the neshama that you put into me remains tahar, especially according to the Mekubalim, who say that the neshama is a chelik elokai mimau. One could raise questions according to the Rambam, who says that neshama is something that is created. But if you say it's that neshama is godliness, then it certainly remains pure. And we, the Jewish people, do not believe in a concept of original sin. Man is born pure because his neshama is pure and perhaps remains pure. But man is born pure. But the more one sins, the more he becomes used to sinning. The more difficult it becomes to refrain from sinning. And the more difficult it becomes for him to do tshuva. And we could suggest that perhaps that's the message according to the manner that the events of Tzaraas takes place. First, the person's house is affected. The person's house is affected. That's completely supernatural. How could disease begin with the house? And then the clothes become affected. Even that is extremely difficult to understand. But somehow you could, when it comes to disease, sometimes the clothes of a person having a certain disease become affected. Not in the form that the Torah talks about it, but the concept exists. Certain diseases, the clothes that the sick person wore has to be burned or thrown out. It's considered dangerous. But so sin initially is not something that comes natural to man. But man makes sin become easier. He makes sin sound like it was something natural, something normal. So in the message of the Tzaraas, it's not just a punishment, but on the contrary, the Tzaraas affects a person in order to teach the person. It's God's way of teaching us about the nature of sin. So it starts off completely unnatural sin, but it ends up being almost natural, almost normal. It becomes part of our personality. And it affects our character traits. And then our character traits affect the way we act. But as far as the question as to why the Torah introduces us to Tzaraas from a different perspective, I think there is a message that the Torah is trying to give us. Now, what causes a person to sin? Specifically, Lashon Hara. It has to do with our perception of ourselves, and our perception of others. Now, sometimes we talk against somebody because we're jealous. Sometimes we talk down about people. Could be because of jealousy also. Would it be because of gaiva, arrogance? Sometimes because of anger. But I want to focus on arrogance and jealousy. Matter of fact, one of the forms of Tzaraas is Sa'es, holding oneself high. In fact, there are midrashim that say that the Mitzorah can't cut his hair because the hair represents his holding himself up high, his attitude towards others, looking down at other people. I think if I was to describe those who talk down about people, who considers others lowly, those of Sa'es, I would say, what's the problem? Why do they think that they are great? Very often, and unfortunately, our community is affected by that to a certain degree. When we evaluate a person, when we evaluate ourselves, we think of the person from the perspective of what he owns, of what he possesses. The Torah, in Lo Sachbod, Lo Sisave, Beis Re'echa, B'chol Asher Lo, whatever he has. So when we see the person, whether that person is us or that person is somebody else, we see their possessions or their lack of possessions as who they are, not something that's extraneous to them. Years ago, there was a certain man, he actually, very nice man, and he was very much involved in the day school that his children went to. He appreciated everything, the education, the Jewish education, the secular education that they were giving his children. And he was always the first to volunteer. When a job needed to be done. But financially, he was a poor person. He didn't have much money. But because of his efforts of giving himself over, he might not have been able to give over his possessions for the school. But more than that, he gave himself over for the school. So he was appointed as a member of the board of the school. And from time to time, with great pride, not pride about himself, never uttered one word of pride about himself being on the board. But with great pride, he would talk about the accomplishments that the day school that his children were going to were making. And from time to time, I would meet him, and he would always saying, this is being built, this is being accomplished. And once I met him, and he stopped talking about it. And I asked him, why, what's going on? He says, I don't know. I'm no longer on the board. I said, how come you're not on the board? He said, the board now consists only of those who are very rich. And the expression they used about us, this was many years ago, but I still remember it, is that we are the dead wood.
Okay.
And what does it mean that we are the dead wood? What it means is that what it means is that we don't have the houses. We're not involved in the social groups. We don't have the money. We don't go on the vacations.
Morty, move your arm out of this one. Morty.
We don't have any of these things. In other words, when they evaluated themselves and they consider themselves people who are Tzaraas, they held their heads high. Why? Because they were not, when they evaluated themselves, they saw their houses, their vacations, their wealth as part of who they were.
Use a verb.
That was them.
You hiccup. I love you.
It was like the leaders of Bavel.
You're gonna use the potty.
That they considered themselves great when it came to taking money. So this is I think the Torah introduces us to Tzaraas by telling us about something that looks like a disease, something that affects the person himself, because the cause of the problem, or part of the cause of the problem, that led a person to look down, to talk against, to look lowly and speak lowly about other people, was the fact when he saw the person, when he saw himself, when he saw his social group, he didn't see just them. He didn't see their neshama. Yes, he saw how they looked, but more important, part of the way they looked, part of the way they wore, was the possessions that they had. So Tzaraas, which bears similarity to physical phenomena, to disease that affects a person, affects the house. There's a message. You know why you acted that way? You acted that way because when you evaluated people, you saw their possessions or lack of possessions as part of who they are. You think you are great because you have possessions, and those possessions define you. And those possessions could be lost overnight. You don't realize that those possessions could be lost overnight. You could lose your house. You could lose your possessions. So that's why it begins to emphasize the point, to let people know why is it that leads people to act in this arrogant manner. And similarly, jealousy also. Very often, jealousy emanates. Not always, but very often it emanates from when I think about that person, I think of him in terms of his possessions. So because of that, the Torah tells us that the Torah warns the person who actually teaches, I should say, teaches the person who talked Lashon Hara. The part of the problem is that when you evaluate people, and sometimes that can result in you having a bad self-perception. Lo sachmod, not to covet. Lo sisave, not to desire that which belongs to the person. You have to focus on yourself. So this is, I think, why the Torah introduces us to, and it's interesting, part of the carbon of a mitzvah is giving the hyssop, dipping the hyssop. The hyssop is the smallest of the bushes. So a person has to learn, in a sense, not to see himself in an arrogant manner. Now, and even where one sees it. Now, I want to discuss the opinion of those who suggest that Tzaraas was a natural phenomenon. It seems very strange. Okay, it's certainly, there is a basis, perhaps, certainly a basis if some of the Mepharshim say it. I think the Rambam seems to hold that way, be of that opinion also, that when it comes to the person, Tzaraas might be a natural phenomenon. But nevertheless, we see from all the Midrashim that the Tzaraas is associated with sins. Yes, the poskim talk about, the Mepharshim talk, how part of the reason for the separation is that one person should not become infected with the Tzaraas from the other person. That's part, those who see it as a natural phenomena explain that as part of the reason. But that's also a lesson, because part of the nature of the cause of Lashon Hara is part of the nature of Lashon Hara is the part of the nature of Lashon Hara is social gathering. The Rambam talks, I think this is very important. The Rambam talks about people sitting together in base mishtos, in places of drinking, and how that leads to Lashon Hara. We have a new phenomena today. In the old days, they used to call it the Kiddush Club. Today, it's beyond that. They got rid of the Kiddush Club. It's no longer a club. They all drink. And so it presents, according to the Rambam, at the end of Hilchos Tumas Tzaraas, he talks very much about those that sit together, and unfortunately, very often in our shuls have become beis mishtos. They ceased to be beis haknesses, and they became beis mishtos. I know that there was a very close friend of mine who from time to time has a minyan in his house in an area that has many observant Jews. And when he has the minyan in his house, they give a very nice kiddush. And of course, everybody, there's a lot of food. And of course, kiddush requires kiddush also. Okay, you could have grape juice, you could have wine. It seems that the beverage of preference is whiskey. And so that's what happens in every shul. So they would serve at this kiddush. They would serve chont. It was really a very nice kiddush. All kinds of foods, pastries. And for kiddush, there was wine, there was grape juice. It was like, in a sense, like the Mishnah of Achashverosh. You could choose what you want. And then some of the wives of the people who came to the Kiddush, who came to the davening, came to the Kiddush, mentioned that they had a concern that their husbands come home drunk. And of course, this affects the Shalom Bayis. And the Rambam says that it's the sitting and drinking together with others that is a cause of intensified Lashon Hara. So, but so in a sense, so because of that, perhaps that's the message. The message is So the message is you have to separate yourself. Chazal tell us that he separated, the one who talked Lashon Hara, separated husband from wife. He separated relatives from each other. He separated friends. Because of that is separate. It's a lesson. In a sense, a person has to know, but I think it's more than just that. Not just to tell him what he did, but perhaps to point out to him how he did it. He did it through a form of socialization. We're not against socialization. On the contrary, we have to come together. But there has to be the proper atmosphere. When you sit at a kiddush, focus on Divrei Torah. As the Rambam points out, that's part of the message. But if everything is supernatural, we understand it. But if it's not supernatural, those who say that the Tzaraas is not supernatural, and it's a natural phenomena, how are we to understand it? We could say the disease is a natural phenomena. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings that disease in particular situations. So when they say it's a natural phenomena, they're describing the nature of the disease. But sometimes that disease comes not just because someone got it from his friend, but perhaps because heaven manipulated that he should get it. Or perhaps more likely that heaven manipulated that he should come in contact with someone who had that disease. And consequently, he became affected. And sometimes he might have received the disease from the person who told him the Lashon Hara. But I think it might even be more than that. There is a parish I've mentioned in the past of the Nesivos, an Eicha, Palge Mayim. And the Nesivos, in his parish, Palge Mayim, discussing the Hatov v'haros, lo mipiel yom teitze haros v'hatov. Not from the mouth of a pie does the bad, in the plural form, the bad things and the good happen. And the Palgamayim is interested in understanding, why is it when we talk about the bad, we talk in the plural form? When we talk about the good, it's in the singular form. Now, if not for what the Palgamayim said, I would suggest a very simple answer. Because when bad things happen to us, every time there's an occurrence, it's a new bad thing. They add up. But when it comes to good, people don't add up the good things. To them, it's all one. So, haros the bad things, because we perceive it as many bad things. That which we perceive as bad. Good, we don't see every time something good happens to us. Sometimes we don't even recognize it. We take it for granted. And sometimes even when we recognize it, it's not something new. It's the same thing as before. And that, to a certain degree, plays a role in our being kaifli tov. We become kaifli tov from people, and we become kaifli tov from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're told the first three makos, Moshe Rabbeinu, Aaron brought the first three makos. Why? Because the Nile, the sand in Egypt, they did Moshe Rabbeinu favors. When he was a baby, he was saved. He didn't drown in the Nile. Svardeya also came from the Nile. So he couldn't do the mark against it. And when the Mitzri, he hid the Mitzri in the sand. So he couldn't hit the sand with kinim. But these aren't living beings. Kafi Tov. It shows that I don't recognize the good that someone done for me. Who is the someone? The Nile is the somebody. The answer is when we become Kafi Tov of the intermediary, we become Kafi Tov from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If we don't recognize what the intermediary did for us, ultimately we don't recognize the one who sent the intermediary. When Moshe Rabbeinu recognized what the Nile did for him, he was recognizing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did to him through the Nile. So and so I think so. This is the halacha. This is what the Kafi Tov we have to recognize that which was done for us. Now it's interesting that so and when we don't recognize the degree of the good that we get, so to a certain degree, that is critical of us, that we're kafli tov. We're kafli tov. And why don't we want to recognize it? Especially when there's another person involved. Because we don't want to believe that someone did something for us. We don't want to have that feeling of debt. I'm not talking about financial debt. I'm talking about emotional debt. It makes us feel smaller. And I think now, but the Palgemayim gives a different answer, different than what I suggested. And the Palgemayim says that you have two types of bad and you have two types of good. There's the bad that we do and the punishment that we get. And there's the good that we do and the reward that we get. So he says, When we say Lo mipiel yom teitze haros, not from the mouth of heaven does the bad in the plural come. That's because when we sinned, we had freedom of choice, bechira chofshis. Yes, to a certain degree. In each step, as I explained before, once the sin becomes more natural, we're more inclined to sin. But those are decisions that we made, and at every moment that becomes our decision. And that's, I mentioned, the Rambam in the Igros says, Paro hu ha-Yetzirah. If you want to know your Yetzirah, what it can become, look at Paro. And we can make it more difficult for us to change our ways because we chose to make it more difficult for us. Vayechazek Hashem eslei Paro. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Paro the ability to withstand the makos, to do what he wanted to do. So on one hand, it was our choice. And then the punishment that we have, the things that turn bad. So the Palgemayim says something that if the Palgemayim wasn't the one to say it, people would scream. If I had said it myself, people would, well, me, they don't care. But if somebody noteworthy would have said it, they would have called him an apikoros. So the Palgemayim says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't make the bad things, but what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does is he withdraws. In a sense, the person becomes subject to the laws of nature. God doesn't intervene. The laws of nature are capable of destroying us. But Adamika Mazla, God has a malach or whatever it is to intervene, to prevent the laws of nature from harming us. But sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu withdraws. He withdraws the protection. And then the laws of nature come in effect. And some days, sometimes it'll affect one way, and times it affects the other way. So lo mipiel yom teitze haros. The bad that we do didn't come from God. And the bad that happened to us as a result didn't come from God either. On the contrary, God withdrew. But when it comes to Tov, the good that we did was also bechira chofshis. God didn't force us to do good. We decided to do good ourselves. But the good that happened as a result of what we did, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought. So lo mipiel yom teitze hatov, not from the mouth of heaven does the good come. That's talking only about the good that we did. But the good that happened to us, that came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That came mipiel yom. That came from heaven. And I think when it comes to Tzaraas, when it comes to many phenomena that are as a punishment, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to a certain degree, removes his protection when we sin. Because every situation is different. And once we're subject to the laws of nature, so it depends who we come in contact with. So even those who say that it's a natural phenomena, but it's a natural phenomena that comes as a result of God withdrawing. And that's why something like Tzaraas could happen, certainly in terms of a human being. I have trouble understanding the opinion of the Rabbi in terms of the other forms of Tzaraas. But that's the way we could understand. Now, this week is the solar eclipse. And Chazal tell us that when there's a solar eclipse and the moon hides the sun from us, that's a bad sign for the nations of the world. And when there's a lunar eclipse, and the moon is hidden from us, so that's a bad sign for the Jewish people, because the nations of the world, they are compared to the Chama, to the sun. The nations, the Jewish people are compared to the moon. And everybody knows that it's scientific fact. So what kind of a sign is it? It's a scientific fact. It's nature. But I think there is a lesson to be learned from it. The covering of the sun, the solar eclipse, reminds us that the nations of the world, when they're subject to the laws of nature, when God doesn't interfere on their behalf, all kinds of things can happen. The unfortunate situation we find ourselves now is that the nations of the world are against the Jewish people. But nevertheless, situations happen that the nations of the world begin to realize that what they allowed to happen to the Jewish people happened to themselves. When they tolerated terrorism in Israel, other countries also had to deal with terrorism. God's intervention, that man has mazel, to a certain degree was removed. It's true, mazel is used as a term for nature, but here it's talking about special intervention. Everything is through nature. And when Klal Yisrael and the eclipse of the moon, so there we have the eclipse of the moon, so it's a sign for Klal Yisrael that if we are not careful how we act, so we are subject to the laws of nature. Nature sometimes does things that we're not used to. And that's the message, I think, of the solar eclipse. On one hand, we have to know that the nations of the world, they might be against the Jewish people, but what they do against the Jewish people will affect them. And when it affects them, very often they begin to understand that we can't allow it to happen to the Jewish people. Because if we allow it to happen to the Jewish people, it's going to affect them. And I think just as we're today, we have to bear all this in mind. When we look at Parshas Tazria, we have to understand we can't look at ourselves in a haughty manner. I mentioned over and over again We have to recognize, not look low down at people, because people in the Beis Medrash, people sitting learning Torah. Yes, that's very important. But don't look down at people that did not have that opportunity, especially when they are fighting to save your lives. Everybody has to recognize what the other one is doing for them. But we have to set the example. And if we don't set the example, we can't expect them to act in that manner. And the lesson is, we can't be kofi tov. We cannot deny. People go around saying they don't need the army. And I always mention what happened in Hebron in 1929. The boys in Hebron Yeshiva were sitting and learning, perhaps on a higher level than many of those learning today. And they were killed. They could have used a Jewish army to protect them. What haughtiness leads people to believe differently? We have to make sure that we don't have the se'es, the haughtiness of the Metzora, of looking down at people. And at the same time, we have to be reminded that it could be that as a result of the nations of the world, our recognizing that the nations of the world sometimes subject themselves, by the way they act to the Jewish people, to subject themselves to the laws of nature, that Be'ezras Hashem, the nations of the world will sometimes recognize that the danger they're putting us in is putting themselves in danger. And at that time, we'll recognize how helping Eretz Yisrael, helping the Jewish people, will in effect help them prevent themselves from facing the same dangers.
So please put questions in the chat. According to the Rabbi, that it's a natural, it might be easier nowadays to say that it could be a fungus, because a bacteria.
Okay. I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you. I've thought of all those possibilities. I don't know that fits in with the Torah, but okay. So it's might be some similarities to a fungus. I would say similarities to a fungus. Yeah. I thought of that possibility. Hello?
Yeah, I don't see any other questions here.
The Ralbag himself, but the Ralbag seems to, when he talks about the clothes, he talks how it goes. It's not the same order of the Rambam, but how the clothes become affected by the person. Okay. I was suggesting just the reverse, that the house and the clothes affect the person, okay, and in a supernatural manner,
depends
in
if
a spiritual manner.
Depends if it's an exterior manifestation of an inner feeling,
right.
or if it has to go from the exterior into the person.
That's right. Okay. Anyway, that's it. Okay. Believe that, or next Sunday, maybe next Sunday we'll